There's a specific kind of quiet that happens around 7:15 in the evening. The dishes are done. The television is off because tonight, the silence doesn't feel like something you need to fill. You sit in the chair that used to be yours and only yours, back when there was another chair across from it that mattered. And somewhere in that quiet, a thought arrives that you didn't invite. Nobody is coming. Not tonight. Maybe not this week. You are 70-something years old, and you have lived a full life, raised children, buried people you loved, built something out of nothing, and still this feeling shows up like it has a key to the house. If you have felt this, you are not broken. You are not ungrateful. And tonight, we are going to talk about the one thing almost nobody says out loud after 70. How lonely it can get, and what that loneliness is actually trying to tell you. In the next 50 minutes, we're not going to pretend this feeling away. We're not going to hand you a list of hobbies and call it healed. We're going to walk together through the honest truths about loneliness after 70. The kind that hides behind a full calendar, the kind that sits at holiday tables, the kind that outlives a marriage. Some of what you hear tonight might sting a little, because it's true. Some of it might feel like someone finally said the thing you've been carrying alone. By the end, you won't have fewer wrinkles or a fuller house. But you might understand, for the first time in a long time, that this ache doesn't mean your life failed. It means you loved enough to notice its absence. And along the way, we'll get to something even more useful than understanding. A few small, honest ways to actually loosen this feeling's grip, not by pretending it away, but by meeting it directly the way you've met every hard thing life has handed you so far. Let's begin. Reason number 1 is the quiet that wasn't there before. Let's start with something so ordinary you might not have even called it loneliness. The sound of your own house. You know the quiet I mean, not the peaceful kind. The kind that used to be filled with someone else's footsteps, or the particular way a certain door used to close, or the low hum of a conversation happening in another room. Have you noticed how loud that quiet can get? Here is what nobody explains to you about this stage of life. A house doesn't just hold people, it holds their sound. And when that sound is gone, because children grew up and left, because a spouse passed, because friends moved closer to their own children in another state, the silence isn't neutral. It's not simply no noise. It's the shape of an absence, and your mind, whether you want it to or not, keeps filling that shape in. You walk past a room and for half a second expect to see someone in it. You set the table for 2 out of 40 years of habit before you catch yourself. You hear a car door outside and some old, automatic part of you still turns toward the window. This is not confusion. This is not memory failing you. This is a nervous system that spent decades learning the rhythm of another person, and that rhythm doesn't disappear just because the person did. Psychologists sometimes call this an anniversary reaction, but it isn't only anniversaries. It's Tuesdays, it's 7:15 in the evening. It's the particular slant of afternoon light that used to mean someone was about to walk in the door. There is also a quieter, less discussed layer to this. Solitude that you choose feels restful. Solitude that arrives because the people around you have simply stopped coming feels like something else entirely. It feels like being left, even when no one meant to leave you. That distinction matters more than people admit. 2 people can sit in the exact same silent room and one is at peace while the other is aching, and the only difference is whether that silence was invited. There's another layer to this that rarely gets named. Homes are full of small, involuntary rituals that were never really about the task itself. They were about the company. Making 2 cups of coffee instead of 1 wasn't really about the coffee. Setting an extra plate wasn't about the plate. It was about the 15 seconds of conversation that used to happen while the kettle boiled. The small check-in, the did you sleep all right, the shared, unremarkable rhythm of 2 lives moving through the same rooms. When that person is gone, the ritual doesn't just lose its purpose, it becomes evidence. Every unused cup in the cabinet, every quiet drive past a place you used to go together, becomes a small, involuntary reminder of what the house used to hold. This is why grief can ambush you in the most ordinary moments, not just the significant ones. It isn't the anniversaries that undo people the most. It's a random Tuesday afternoon, a smell, a song on the radio. Most of what you feel in your own home after 70 isn't really about the house at all. It's about how many hands built the noise that used to fill it, and how few of those hands are still nearby. That's not you falling apart. That's love with nowhere left to go. If this is the quiet you live in most evenings, I want you to know something before we move to the next point. The ache proves the life was full, not that it's now empty of worth. A house that holds this much silence once held that much laughter. That's not a small thing. That's the whole story, still living in the walls. And there's something worth noticing in that. The very fact that silence can feel this loud to you means you built a life with enough noise, enough people, enough love in it to leave an echo this large. Some people reach 70 having built so little connection that an empty room simply feels like an empty room to them, nothing more. If yours feels like so much more than that, it's because you filled it once generously on purpose for decades. Keep that thought close as we move to the next reason. Reason number 2 is being surrounded and still unseen. From the silence of an empty room, let's talk about something almost stranger. The loneliness that happens in a room full of people who love you. Have you ever sat at a family dinner, surrounded by your own children and grandchildren, food on the table, noise everywhere, and still felt like you were watching the whole thing from behind glass? Like you were present, but not quite included? This is one of the most disorienting forms of loneliness, because it comes with no obvious explanation. You're not alone. You're not forgotten, not exactly. But somewhere along the way, conversations started happening around you instead of with you. Decisions about the holidays, about a grandchild's school, about where everyone will spend Thanksgiving, they get made in a group chat you're not on, or a phone call that happens after you've gone to bed. Nobody intends cruelty here. It's simply that life moves at the speed of the youngest, busiest people in the room, and that pace, without anyone deciding it, starts to leave older voices a half step behind. You might notice you've become the person things are announced to, rather than a person things are decided with. Your opinion gets a polite nod rather than a real debate. Your stories, the ones that used to hold a table's attention, now get a smile and a subject change. And here is the part that's hardest to say out loud. It can feel worse to be lonely in a crowded room than to be lonely in an empty one, because an empty room doesn't ask you to perform contentment. A crowded room does. You learn to smile at the right moments, laugh a beat behind everyone else because you caught the joke a little late, nod along to references you don't quite follow. And all of that quiet effort is exhausting in a way nobody sees because from the outside, it looks like a good visit. There's a particular moment many people describe, almost identically, no matter their background. A family gathering winding down, everyone standing near the door saying goodbye, and a plan for next time gets casually made. A trip, a birthday, a weekend, and it becomes clear, gently but unmistakably, that the plan doesn't quite include you the way it once would have. Maybe it's the stares at the cabin. Maybe it's just assumed you'd find the trip tiring. Nobody says it cruelly. Nobody even necessarily notices they've said it at all. But you notice. You always notice. This isn't about your family failing you most of the time. It's about a simple, unspoken shift. As people age, the world doesn't usually decide to exclude them on purpose. It just stops remembering to include them on purpose, too. And those are very different things, but they feel almost identical from the inside. That's not paranoia. That's a very accurate read of a room that has quietly moved on without meaning to. It helps to remember that most families don't have a script for this. Nobody hands out instructions on how to keep an aging parent woven into the daily fabric of decisions rather than just the occasional Sunday visit. Your children are often juggling careers, their own children, and 100 quiet pressures of their own. Their oversight usually isn't a judgment about your worth. It's simply the natural drift of a busy household that hasn't stopped to ask, who have we forgotten to actually include this month? That doesn't erase the sting of it. But it does mean the fix is rarely as dramatic as it feels in the moment. It's often as simple as someone, sometimes you, gently saying, "I'd love to be part of that conversation next time," out loud, instead of quietly absorbing the omission and calling it fine. Here's the mini payoff worth carrying with you. Being surrounded and still feeling invisible is not proof that you don't matter to these people. It's proof that closeness takes maintenance, on both sides, and that nobody ever taught your family how to actively include an older voice instead of just tolerating its presence. That's fixable. That's not a verdict on your worth. If what you just watched reminded you of something true, don't just scroll past it. Hit like, because that tells us to keep making content that respects your time instead of talking down to you. Subscribe if you don't want to miss the next one. And drop a comment with one thing life has taught you that you wish more young people understood, because someone reading tonight might need it. Reason number 3 is the disappearing witnesses to your own life. If the last point was about being unseen by the people still around you, this one is about the people who no longer are. Think about the friend who knew you before you were anyone's parent or grandparent. The one who remembers the version of you that made mistakes at 22. Who was there for the wedding, the layoff, the year everything fell apart and quietly came back together. How many of those people are still on the other end of a phone? This is one of the cruelest and least talked about parts of growing older. You don't just lose people, you lose witnesses. Every person who has known you for decades is carrying a piece of your history that no one else has. The way you used to laugh before life got heavy. The argument you had in 1974 that changed the direction of your whole career. The version of your marriage only they saw up close. When that person dies or slips into memory loss, or simply becomes too frail to call, a piece of verified truth about your own life goes with them. Nobody else can confirm it happened. Nobody else remembers it exactly the way you do. This is different from grief over losing a person. It's a subtler, stranger loss. The loss of proof. You start to feel less like a person with a rich, textured history, and more like the only remaining source for a story nobody else can check anymore. Younger family members love you, but they only know the edited, grandparent-shaped version of who you are. They don't know the reckless 25-year-old, or the terrified new parent, or the person who once almost gave up on everything and didn't. That fuller self starts to feel like it's evaporating one funeral at a time, one skipped phone call at a time, one we lost touch at a time. This is part of why so many people over 70 describe a specific kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with how many people are physically nearby. It's the loneliness of being the last one standing who remembers. And that is a heavy, quiet weight to carry, mostly in private, because there's rarely anyone left to carry it with you. There's a particular sting to the phone call you now hesitate to make. The friend from 40 years ago who you'd normally call to say, "Remember that summer?" Only to realize with a small jolt that they passed 2 years ago and you simply forgot for a second, because some part of you still expects them to be reachable. Or the address book, still full of names, more than half of which now belong to people who are gone, each one a small, private funeral you observe alone every time you flip past that page. This is not something people prepare you for. Nobody tells you that surviving a long life means slowly becoming the only remaining archive of dozens of relationships that once felt permanent. There is, oddly, a kind of quiet honor buried inside this loss, even though it rarely feels like one in the moment. To be the last one who remembers is also to be the one entrusted with remembering well. The one person left who can still say a name out loud with the exact right affection, who can still correct the record when a grandchild gets a family story slightly wrong, who can still, in a single sentence, bring someone back to life for a moment in the mind of a listener. That is not a small responsibility. It is, in its own understated way, one of the most important jobs left to do. That's not you being overly sentimental. That's grief for a version of yourself that's running out of people who can testify it was real. The payoff here matters. The fact that fewer people remember your full story doesn't erase that story. It only means the responsibility of holding it has shifted, almost entirely, onto you, and that is worth doing with pride, not shame, because you are still the one true keeper of a life worth remembering. Reason number 4 is the shame of admitting any of this out loud. So far we've named quiet houses, crowded rooms, and disappearing friends. But underneath almost all of it sits something that keeps people from ever saying any of this to another human being. Shame. Have you ever had someone ask, "How are you doing?" and answered, "Fine, keeping busy," when the true answer was closer to, "I haven't had a real conversation in 5 days"? There is an unspoken script that older adults in this country are handed, and it says something like this: you're supposed to be content by now. You raised your children, you worked your career, you're supposed to be enjoying the golden years, gardening, grandkids, leisure. Loneliness doesn't fit that script, so admitting it can feel like admitting failure, as if a full, well-lived life was supposed to earn you immunity from feeling alone, and needing help feels like proof it didn't. There's also a generational layer to this. Many people now in their 70s and 80s were raised in a culture that prized stoicism, self-reliance, not burdening anyone. You were taught, maybe by parents who lived through hardship you can barely imagine, that you handle things yourself and you don't complain. So when loneliness shows up, the instinct isn't to reach out. It's to hide it, tidy it away, Present a composed face to your children so they don't worry, to your friends so they don't pity you, to yourself so you don't have to sit with how much it actually hurts. But here is the quiet danger in that silence. Loneliness that goes unspoken doesn't go away, it just goes underground, and it tends to get heavier the longer it stays hidden, because isolation convinces you that you're the only one feeling this way, when in truth, a huge portion of people your age are sitting in the exact same silence, each one convinced they're uniquely failing at aging well. You are not uniquely failing at anything. You are carrying something extremely common, made heavier only by the fact that almost nobody talks about it honestly. Think about how rarely this comes up even among close friends your own age. Two people who have both been sitting home alone most evenings will still greet each other with staying busy, can't complain. Because admitting the truth first feels like handing the other person a burden, or worse, revealing a weakness neither one wants to be the first to name. So the silence multiplies itself. Not because people don't feel it, but because everyone is quietly waiting for someone else to go first. That's the real tragedy hidden inside this shame. An entire generation of people all feeling some version of the same ache, all convinced they are the only one, all too polite or too proud to say so out loud, sitting alone together without ever realizing it. That's not weakness. That's the cost of being raised to never ask for anything. And here's where this point lands. The moment you say the true sentence out loud, even quietly, even just to yourself first, I am lonely, and that's allowed to be true, something in that shame starts to loosen. Naming it doesn't fix it instantly, but it stops it from being a secret you're guarding all alone. Think about what it might mean to say it to just one person. Not everyone, not a crowd, just one trusted daughter, one old friend, one person you know won't flinch. I've been lonelier than I let on. That single sentence, spoken once, tends to do something strange and immediate. It invites the other person to stop performing their own composure too. More often than people expect, saying the true thing out loud is met not with pity, but with relief, because the other person was very possibly hiding something almost identical, waiting for permission to admit it first. If you're still with me, I want to pause here for a second because we're at the halfway point, and I know some of what we've talked about might feel heavy. I want you to know why we're doing this. We're not naming these things to make you feel worse. We're naming them because loneliness that gets spoken out loud, even just in the quiet of your own living room while a voice on a screen says it with you, already weighs less than loneliness that stays completely silent. So let's keep going, because the second half of this video is where things start to shift. Reason number 5 is the specific ache of losing the person who translated the world for you. For many of you watching, this next one may be the heaviest, so I want to say it gently. If you lost a spouse or a longtime partner, you already know there's a loneliness that has nothing to do with an empty chair at the table. It's the loneliness of losing the one person who understood a joke without you finishing it. A marriage, or any long partnership, isn't only companionship. It's a shared translation system built over decades. Your spouse knew what you meant when you sighed a certain way. They remembered the names of people you'd forget. They filled in the second half of your sentences, understood which memories were fondly exaggerated and which were painfully true, and quietly corrected you when you got a story wrong, without ever needing to say so out loud. When that person is gone, you don't just lose a companion. You lose your interpreter for the entire world you built together. Every inside joke now has no one left who gets it. Every remember when has no one to remember it with you, which means, in a very real sense, some of those memories start to feel less solid, less shared, more like something you might have imagined alone. This is why widowhood loneliness often gets worse, not better, after the first year, because the casseroles stop coming, the check-in calls space out, everyone assumes you're adjusting, while the actual daily task of living without your translator is only just beginning to be understood by you. You might reach for the phone to tell them something funny that happened, and catch yourself halfway through dialing a number that no longer answers. That is not a sign you're stuck in grief incorrectly. There is no correct pace for this. What you're mourning isn't only a person. It's a shared language that only the two of you ever spoke fluently, and now you're the last native speaker left. There's a particular loneliness in laughing at a memory and having no one to turn to, because turning to share a look was half of what made the memory funny in the first place. There's a particular loneliness in making a decision about the house, about money, about a grandchild's wedding, entirely on your own, when for 50 years that decision would have been a conversation, a negotiation, a shared verdict reached together on the porch or in bed at night. People will tell you it gets easier, and in some ways it does. But easier doesn't mean the missing stops. It usually just means you get better at carrying it without it showing on your face quite so often. Some days, that carrying feels almost manageable. Other days, a wedding anniversary, a certain song, the particular way the light falls through the kitchen window in October, it arrives all over again, as sharply as it did in the first weeks, and that's not a setback. Grief for a shared language doesn't move in a straight line toward over it. It moves in slow, uneven circles, and every single lap around that circle still counts as living, even the hard ones. That's not you failing to move on. That's love outliving the person who was its other half. Here's what's worth holding on to before we move forward. The language you built with them doesn't have to die completely just because you're the only one left who speaks it. You can still tell the joke. You can still say the names. Every time you do, you keep a small piece of that shared world alive, even in a room with no one else in it who remembers. Reason number 6 is the quiet loss of being needed for anything. Let's shift now to something less about a specific person and more about a specific role. When was the last time someone truly needed you, not wanted your company, but needed your help, your hands, your decision-making, the way people needed you when you were raising a family or running a household or leading a team? For most of your adult life, you were needed constantly. Someone depended on you to make dinner, sign a permission slip, fix the car, run the department, hold the family together during a crisis. That need, exhausting as it sometimes was, gave your days an undeniable shape and your existence an obvious purpose. Then, gradually, the need starts to disappear. Children grow into capable adults who don't require your daily guidance. Careers end. Bodies slow down enough that even the physical tasks you used to handle now get quietly taken over by someone else, sometimes without you even being asked. And what's left in that gap is a strange, disorienting kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of missing people, but the loneliness of missing usefulness. Human beings are wired to feel valuable through contribution. It's one of the oldest, most consistent patterns across cultures and generations. We don't just want connection, we want to matter to that connection, to be load-bearing in someone else's life. When that role fades, even gently and with good intentions from everyone around you, Dad, don't worry about it. I've got it. Mom, just relax, you've done enough. It can feel less like rest and more like retirement from your own significance. You start to wonder what you're actually for now, in a world that has quietly reorganized itself to no longer require your hands. It shows up in small, almost invisible ways. Someone else now handles the finances you used to manage without a second thought. Someone else drives. Someone else decides what's for dinner, or whether the gutters need cleaning, or how the holidays will be organized this year. Each one of these, on its own, seems like a kindness. Nobody wants you overexerting yourself. But stacked together, month after month, they quietly dismantle the architecture of a life that used to run through you. You go from being the person everyone checked with to the person everyone checks on. That's a much bigger shift in identity than it sounds like on paper, because being checked on, however lovingly, is a fundamentally different relationship to the world than being needed by it. This isn't self-pity. It's an honest response to a real shift. The currency you spent decades earning your place with, being needed, has been replaced with something that sounds kinder but can feel emptier. Being cared for. That's not you being difficult or ungrateful. That's a person who spent a lifetime being essential, grieving the loss of that role. There's a reason retirement, for so many people, feels less like relief and more like a small grief that nobody sends flowers for. You spent a lifetime answering to a title: parent, provider, foreman, nurse, teacher, the person the family called first in a crisis, and titles come with an unspoken promise of relevance. When the title fades and nothing obvious replaces it, it can feel like the world quietly stopped keeping score of you. But here's the turn this point deserves. Being needed for tasks was never actually the deepest kind of matching. It was just the version your working years happened to run on. There is a different, quieter kind of importance available now. Being needed for wisdom, for presence, for simply being who you are in a room. Think of the grandmother whose grandchildren don't need her to cook for them, but still call her first when something in their life falls apart, simply because of how steady her voice sounds on the other end of the line. Think of the retired foreman who no longer manages a crew, but whose opinion, when finally asked, still carries more weight in a family decision than anyone else's in the room. That kind of matching doesn't come with a job description, but it's no less real, and we'll come back to that. Reason number 7 is being quietly left out of a world that moved on without asking. Now let's talk about something a little more modern and a little more uncomfortable. Have you ever been in a room where everyone was laughing at something on a phone or coordinating plans in a group text, and you simply weren't part of it? Not because anyone excluded you on purpose, but because the world just assumed you either wouldn't understand or wouldn't want to be bothered. This is one of the newer forms of loneliness, and it's a strange one because it isn't really personal, it's structural. The world has reorganized itself around technology and speed in ways that quietly assume a certain kind of user, younger, faster, always online. Group chats replace phone calls. Invitations happen through apps you were never taught to use. Photos and updates about your own grandchildren circulate in digital spaces you don't have access to. Not because your family is hiding them from you, but because nobody thought to loop you in. You've become, without anyone deciding it cruelly, a little bit outside the loop of your own family's daily life. And here's the part that stings the most. This exclusion often gets quietly justified by everyone involved, including you, as "that's just not for our generation," or "I wouldn't understand all that anyway." That assumption, repeated enough times, starts to feel true, even when it isn't. You are just as capable of learning, adapting, and connecting as you ever were. What's changed is that the world stopped designing its default communication style around you, and started treating your exclusion from it as natural instead of accidental. This is a very modern kind of loneliness, being physically present in a family, a neighborhood, a country, while being functionally invisible to the systems that now carry most everyday connection. It compounds the other kinds of loneliness we've talked about tonight because it adds a layer of not just unseen but unreachable. Even when people do think of you, the path to actually including you has quietly become more complicated than it used to be, and complications, unfortunately, are often the first thing that gets skipped in a busy life. Think about how much of daily connection has quietly migrated onto a screen. Most people your age were never given a real chance to learn. Not because you couldn't, but because nobody sat down and taught you the way you once patiently taught a child to ride a bike or balance a checkbook. A photo of your own grandchild's first day of school might travel to 40 relatives in an instant, and reach you, if at all, 3 weeks later secondhand at a dinner where everyone else has already seen it, already commented on it, already moved on to the next thing. You're not uninterested. You were simply never handed a key to that particular door. And it's worth saying plainly, wanting to be part of that world is not a small or silly wish. Wanting to see the photo the same day everyone else did, wanting to be looped into the joke instead of having it explained to you a week later, flattened and no longer funny, that's not vanity. That's simply wanting to belong to the present tense of your own family's life, instead of only its past. That's not you being technologically behind. That's a world that redesigned its front door without checking whether everyone still had a key. Here's the payoff worth holding on to. Being outside a digital loop is not the same as being outside your family's heart. The systems changed. The love, in most cases, did not. And there are simple, human ways to close that gap that don't require you to master anything. Sometimes it's as small as someone deciding to make one phone call a week, instead of assuming a text was enough. Reason number 8, and this is the one I want you to sit with the longest, is the difference between being alone and being lonely, because confusing the two is where so much of this pain quietly multiplies. Ask yourself honestly, when you're by yourself, is it the quiet that hurts? Or is it the belief that the quiet means something is wrong with you? Consider two people, both 78, both widowed, both living alone in similar houses on similar streets. One spends her afternoons in a quiet chair by the window, reading, remembering, occasionally crying, occasionally smiling, feeling the fullness of a life she's grateful to have lived. The other sits in an almost identical chair, in an almost identical silence, but every minute of it feels like confirmation that she's been discarded, forgotten, left behind by a world that moved on without her. Same chair, same silence, same number of visitors this month. And yet one woman is at peace and the other is in genuine pain. What's different isn't the circumstance. What's different is the story each of them is quietly telling herself about what that circumstance means. Here is a truth that very few people explain clearly, and it might be the most important idea in this entire video. Solitude and loneliness are not the same experience wearing different names. Solitude is the state of being physically alone. Loneliness is the feeling that you are disconnected, unseen, or unwanted. And here is the crucial part. You can have one without the other. You can be entirely alone in a quiet house and feel completely at peace, connected to your own thoughts, your memories, your faith, your sense of self. And you can be in a room full of people, even people who love you, and feel utterly lonely, exactly as we described earlier tonight. The writer May Sarton once put this beautifully: loneliness is the poverty of self. Solitude is the richness of self. Read that again, slowly, because it changes the entire conversation. Loneliness is what happens when you feel disconnected from your own worth, when the silence around you starts to feel like evidence that you don't matter. Solitude is what happens when that same silence becomes a place where you finally get to hear your own thoughts clearly, where you get to sit with a life you built and actually take it in, without needing anyone else's noise to distract you from it. This isn't a small semantic trick either. It changes what you actually do with a quiet afternoon. If you believe silence is proof of abandonment, you'll spend that silence bracing, waiting, aching for the phone to ring. If you understand that silence can simply be silence, sometimes sad, sometimes peaceful, sometimes both at once, you free yourself to actually live inside it, instead of merely surviving it while waiting for someone to rescue you from it. The goal of tonight was never to convince you that being alone is inherently a problem to be solved. The goal is to help you tell the difference, because so much of the pain in this stage of life doesn't come from solitude itself. It comes from believing that solitude proves you're unworthy of company, when very often it simply means the room is quiet and nothing more sinister than that. When you can look at an empty afternoon and think, this is mine, this is peaceful, I get to decide what this means, instead of, this is proof that I've been forgotten, something fundamental shifts. The silence stays exactly the same. What you carry into it changes everything. That's not you finally getting over your loneliness. That's you learning to tell the difference between an empty room and an empty life. And they are not the same thing, no matter how similar they can feel at 7:15 in the evening. And once you can see that difference clearly between an empty room and an empty life, a natural question follows, and it's reason number 9. If solitude isn't the enemy, what do you actually do with the loneliness that is real, no matter what we call it? Have you ever picked up the phone to call someone, hovered your thumb over their name, and put it back down, telling yourself, I don't want to bother them? Almost everyone over 70 has done this. And here is the quiet, important truth hiding underneath it. The fear of being a bother is one of the most common and most misleading feelings in later life. You spent decades being the one others could lean on, the parent who dropped everything, the friend who showed up, the neighbor who noticed. Somewhere along the way, that same generosity turned inward and became a rule. Don't ask for anything. Don't take up space. Don't be a burden. But think about it honestly from the other direction. When someone you love calls you out of the blue, just to talk, just because they were thinking of you, does it feel like a burden? Or does it feel like a gift? A small proof that you matter to someone's day. It's almost always the second one. And yet we rarely extend ourselves the same grace we'd instantly offer someone else. Loneliness, it turns out, is rarely solved by waiting to be reached. It's most often interrupted by someone deciding to go first. And that someone can be you. Not in a grand, dramatic way. In small, deliberately repeated ways. The same weekly phone call to the same person at the same time, until it becomes a shared ritual instead of a nervous exception. Saying yes to the one invitation you'd normally decline out of habit or fatigue. Writing an actual card in your own handwriting to someone who hasn't heard from you in a while. Not because it's efficient, but because it says unmistakably, I thought of you enough to do this the slow way. None of this erases the deeper losses we've talked about tonight. A phone call doesn't replace a spouse. A card doesn't undo 40 years of shared history disappearing with a friend. But loneliness, unlike grief, responds to small, repeated action in a way that very few other emotional wounds do. It is, in that sense, one of the more solvable aches of this stage of life, even when it doesn't feel that way at 7:15 in the evening. Some of you will find that reconnection through an old friend you finally call after years of silence. Some will find it in a neighbor you start walking with twice a week, almost by accident, until it becomes the best part of your Tuesdays. Some will find it in a church group, a senior center card game, a volunteer shift at a library. Not because any of those things sound thrilling on paper, but because showing up somewhere regularly on a schedule around the same familiar faces rebuilds exactly the kind of low-pressure, everyday connection that a full calendar of big family events can never quite replace. That's not desperation. That's the exact same courage you used to build every meaningful relationship you've ever had. You just haven't needed to use it in a while. So what does that actually look like tomorrow morning, when you wake up and the day stretches